There are those moments in life, aren't there, when something or other, the penny just drops, something that you've been puzzled over, and then suddenly you see it. My mind goes back to when I was in year 8. Well, in those days, they called it Form 2 of secondary school, but it's different school years now. And my maths teacher, and I was never very good at maths, was struggling to explain to me Pythagoras' theorem. How many of you remember Pythagoras' theorem? Yeah, some of you admitting it. How many of you actually understood it at the time? Yes, yeah. Well, I didn't, and I remember in a maths test, I ended up getting detention from my maths teacher because when I copied out Pythagoras' theorem, I got it wrong. But as we all know, in any right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. So there we have it, Pythagoras' theorem. And the moment came in that detention class when the penny dropped for me, and I assured my maths teacher that I understood Pythagoras' theorem. I wonder if you can think of any of those penny dropping moments in your life. Well, Matthew, the writer of the first gospel of our New Testament, has recorded the moment when the penny seriously dropped for a man called Simon Peter. Now, he was a fisherman who then became a foundational figure in the establishment of the church. And you've heard his name crop up in the reading that Lou just read for us now, and also there from Acts 2, with which I started the service, and he preached that sermon. And even today, you'll come across churches called St. Peter's. Well, they're named after him. And here's what Jesus said to Peter in this story when the penny dropped. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Messiah is the Hebrew for anointed. Christ is the Greek for anointed. They mean exactly the same thing. In other words, Peter realized Jesus was the one that they'd been waiting for. He was the one whom God had promised through their holy scriptures who would be the savior of his people. So the question is, how does an uneducated fisherman working the Sea of Galilee come to that conclusion, come to that unshakable conviction that this man Jesus was God's promised Messiah, God's promised Christ? Now, here on Sunday mornings, we've been following a series called From Simon to Peter. Simon was Simon's birth name, if you like. And then Jesus gave him a new name, Peter, which means the rock. And he said, on this rock I will build this church. So if I refer to Simon, I mean Peter. And if you hear me saying Peter, I mean Simon. And sometimes it's Simon Peter. He's got those two names. And bit by bit, he makes this journey from the ordinary fisherman minding his own business to the one on whom Jesus says he will build his church. Bit by bit, Peter observed the authority with which Jesus spoke. He saw the miraculous powers that he exercised. He saw the love, the compassion, the care, the integrity that Jesus demonstrated. And it all began to add up. For Peter, it all pointed in one direction, and it demanded just one conclusion. And some 2,000 years later, it's still the same. We've heard Lou, and she was on a journey of understanding herself. And there are many others here I know who could also tell similar stories. I have my own. And we've all got different starting points, different situations, different contexts. But we're weighing Jesus up, asking, well, who was he? Who is he? Peter declared him the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God who was unique in every way. How did Jesus draw that out of Peter? Well, he asked a couple of questions. We're talking now probably a year or more into Peter and Simon and Jesus getting to know each other. We're told this, Matthew 16, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they replied, well, some say John the Baptist. He was somebody who had preceded Jesus. Others say Elijah. Well, that's a name drawn from centuries before in the Old Testament. And still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets, again, some 800 years before. Yes, says Jesus, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And that's when Peter blurts it out. You are the Messiah. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus knew that people were talking about him, wondering about him. Some were drawn to him, some were openly hostile against him. And he knew that his disciples knew what these other people were saying about him, what the speculation was. So he wants to pin it down. Can I suggest that some 2,000 years later, it's still the same? Do you know, books are still being written and websites multiply. On Thursday, I put into Google, who is Jesus? And Google returned 5,580,000 approximately websites to which I could turn for an answer to that question. I didn't bother. I didn't know where to start. So the fascination, if you like, with Jesus of Nazareth continues to this day. And if Jesus were to ask us the same question he asked his disciples back then, what would your answer be? I wonder, might you agree with Peter? But let me tell you about something that particularly intrigues me about this story, and it's a bit of reading between the lines. It's the stage on which it took place. It's where the questions were asked. We're told it was Caesarea Philippi. There are big clues in the name. First of all, Philippi. It's a region some 25 miles northeast of the Sea of Galilee, and it's no longer Jewish territory. This is Gentile territory where non-Jews were. And the ruler of that area was somebody called Philip the Tetrarch. I'm not quite sure what a tetrarch is, but obviously he had some authority in the area. And he was only there with that authority by consent of the Roman emperor, who was, of course, in charge. But Philip wanted this town to be a legacy. And so the Philippi bit comes from the name of Philip the Tetrarch. The Caesarea bit comes from Philip recognizing that he can only be a tetrarch because Caesar has given him the authority to do it. So it's a place that was renamed in honor of his own honor, but also with more than a nod to Caesar Augustus back in Rome. In Caesarea Philippi, there was a magnificent marble temple, therefore dedicated to Caesar. And today there's still a plaque commemorating the site. The seeds of emperor worship, by the way, were being sown here. Seeds which then, when they flowered a generation later, resulted in vicious persecution against the followers of Jesus. But that's another story. And so I find myself wondering that Jesus chose where to ask the question very deliberately. I wonder, was this magnificent temple to Caesar, with its towers and its portals gleaming and glinting in the sunlight, was that the backdrop to when Jesus asked his question? But there's more. Before Caesarea Philippi was known as Caesarea Philippi, it was known as Panias, which commemorated the Greek god Pan. And a grotto in the mountains was reputed to be this god's birthplace. And Pan was the legendary god of nature and fertility in ancient paganism, and his worship was once important in the town which had once borne his name, which is now Caesarea Philippi. And if you go back even further, the name and the town, the region, was linked with many shrines that were set up for the worship of Baal, a false god whose ugly head pops up in the Old Testament scriptures. But it seems to me almost inconceivable that Jesus did not deliberately choose this setting to ask his challenging question of his disciples. Who am I? Not just in the light of competing Jewish claims for who he might be, but against the backdrop of competing pagan claims of who the gods really are. Jesus chose that place to ask his question. So when Jesus, through this question and Peter's answer, set out his stall for his unrivaled uniqueness, I want you to think of Jesus in so doing as throwing down a gauntlet, the repercussions of which are still being felt today, because Jesus was and still is a controversial figure with some most outrageous claims being made by him, by himself. Jesus wasn't just one among many. He was the one and the only. So you see why I see this question that we've drawn from Peter's story still relevant today and challenging to us today. When I ask, well, what might your answer be to that question? Who am I? You can explore answers if you go to our own church's website. There's a drop-down menu under our Christian faith where I explain something of what the gospel is in a nutshell and in a very brief form. At Worle Baptist Church, come together with other Baptist churches in the area and run an Alpha course. It's online at the moment, and that's a 13-week course which enables people to explore those questions. And so if that's something which might interest you, your interest hopefully has been piqued by this morning in our celebration of God's Spirit, in the thanksgiving we give to him, and in that question that Jesus still poses us today. That's just one route. I don't recommend you try all 5,580,000. It'll take you quite some time.